We are delighted to be kicking off our 2025 Hatfield Park Lecture Series with this exhibition and panel on Spycraft and the Gunpowder Plot. So we're extremely fortunate here at Hatfield to hold the Cecil Papers in our archives. These are the working papers of William Cecil, the first Baron Burghley, and Robert Cecil, the first Earl of Salisbury. Both were Chief Ministers to Queen Elizabeth I, and Robert was Chief Minister to James after Elizabeth's death. So their papers really offer an intimate view of the inner workings of the state during the late Tudor and early Jacobean periods. And of course, one of the most significant events of that early Jacobean period was the Gunpowder Plot conspiracy, or the powder treason, as it was called at the time. Robert Cecil, who's over there on the wall, actually, if you want to get a mental image, Robert Cecil was at the heart of this investigation, really. So his papers tell at least a part of the story of the plot's aftermath through correspondence and conspirator statements. I won't say too much more on the plot because we have this really fantastic panel of experts for you here, consisting of Stephen Alford in the centre, Catherine over on your right, and Nadine Ackerman. So Stephen is going to be opening and closing the panel for us today, discussing the events of the Gunpowder Plot and the subsequent investigation led by Robert Cecil. We're then going to have Catherine, who will speak on the aftermath of the plot in the Tower of London, where many an interrogation took place, and Nadine, who's come all the way from the Netherlands to be with us, is going to speak to us on how spycraft techniques were used by those involved in the plot and in its investigation. There is going to be a Q&A session after all of our panelists have finished speaking, so do salt some questions away to ask them. But yes, let's get into it. As I said, Stephen is going to be our first and final speaker as well this evening. Stephen's Professor of Early Modern British History at the University of Leeds, and he's taught previously at Cambridge for 15 years as well. Stephen's published 7 books on Tudor history, 2 of which relate specifically to the early Cecils, with his most recent book, All His Spies, concentrating on the life of Robert Cecil. As I said, we'll hear from Stephen both at the opening and at the end, but he's going to start now with a look at the narrative of the plot and its key figures. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Vanis. That's wonderful. It's wonderful to be here in this extraordinary hall, talking in part about a man who is just over on the wall there, who's sort of presiding, who's present with us. Well, I have taken my title from that great guide to British history, Seller and Yeatman's 1066. And all that. By far the best plot in history. And the day and month of it, though not, of course, the year, are well known to be utterly, even maddeningly memorable. The Gunpowder Plot, the powder treason. But the year, of course, was 1605, 420 years ago today. It was a treason with Elizabethan roots, deep roots, in difficult decades, where political loyalty to the state and personal religious faith were fused and confused in ways which caused extraordinary anxiety for the government of Queen Elizabeth I, who felt that England was beset as a Protestant kingdom by Catholic enemies abroad, France, Spain, the Pope, the papacy, all the powers of Europe, and also at home. There was a deep fear all the way through the 1570s, into the 1580s, into the 1590s, very much the context for the plot that we're going to be thinking about tonight, that sort of married together this sense of political danger, plot and conspiracy against Queen and country and the Catholic cause. And there are some images on the screen here which just give you a sense and a flavour of that, of the polemic of the exchange of extreme views by both sides, Elizabeth's government and dissident, emigre, English, Catholic polemicists, about the threats and the dangers. A prominent writer here was Robert Cecil's father, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who's seen just down here. And these are some of the works and some of the images that would have been very familiar for Elizabethans in framing religion as a political issue, religion as a security issue, the very existence of the state and of the monarchy. That was the reign of Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth died in 1603, and she was succeeded by King James VI of Scotland, James I, James of Great Britain, there was a sense perhaps of the possibility of a new start, a fresh start. An easing of penal laws against Catholics, which in Elizabeth's reign had seen Catholics fined and imprisoned and isolated and effectively treated as at least potential traitors to the crown, and possibly even the promise of toleration, that Catholics may be tolerated. The time was perhaps right, with a new king and in a new reign. But that didn't happen. And for many Catholics, early hopes in James's reign were disappointed. One of the key documents, which I think makes a lot of sense when we think about the timing of the Gunpowder Plot, and certainly the origins of the plot, was King James's royal proclamation on the 22nd of February 1604, which looked for English Catholics just like the same old routine. Priests, Jesuits, seminarians expelled from England, what seemed to be again the old penal crackdown on faith in the interests of Protestant monarchy. So there was a response, an extreme response, by a small group of men. And one Guy Fawkes describes this response in 1605, thinking back to a meeting that took place probably at about the Easter of 1604, a practice in general against His Majesty for relief of the Catholic cause, a plot discussed. And so the response, and so the recruitment of plotters, of conspiracists. The chief plotter was Robert Catesby, a Northamptonshire gentleman, really the organiser of the Gunpowder Plot. He was single-minded. He recognised that with new peace between England and Spain, of course, famously had been at war in Elizabeth's reign, there was a new peace from 1604. They realised that English Catholics would not have help from Spain, that they would have to act for themselves. So Catesby recruited his close friend, Thomas Winter, a soldier, a man of military experience in France and Flanders in the 1590s, a talented linguist, quite an intellectual in many ways. And he recruited also John Wright, who was Winter's cousin, a Yorkshireman from the East Riding. And they, in turn, recruited Thomas Percy, a cousin of the Earl of Northumberland, constable of Alnwick Castle, a gentleman pensioner, somebody who was actually physically close to the king, part of the king's personal bodyguard. And then finally, the notorious Guy Fawkes. Now, I do think that if Catesby hadn't died, and I'll talk a little bit about the circumstances in which he died in a couple of minutes' time, if Catesby hadn't died, we'd be thinking about this as Catesby's plot. We think of the Gunpowder Plot and Guy Fawkes, famously, absolutely kind of inscribed in the memory. This would have been Catesby's plot. He's the great power behind it. But each of these 5 principal plotters, each brought something I think, sort of unique to the conspiracy. Catesby, the visionary, rather kind of twisted kind, but a visionary. Winter, the brain. Percy, the organiser. Fawkes, in a sense, the workhorse. And all of these men had certain things in common. They were, of course, Catholic gentlemen, and they were gentlemen. They were described as esquires and gentlemen. They are all men of the same generation in their early to middle 30s. Some had been supporters of the late Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, in his failed uprising in 1601, and they were certainly all men with long-term grievances and a track record of trying to open negotiations in Elizabeth's reign for Spanish aid for English Catholics. They were, by their nature, plotters. Their plan was bold, and it's described here by Fawkes, but it's Catesby's plan. All five consulting together of the means how to execute the same, and taking a vow among ourselves for secrecy, Catesby propounded to have it performed by gunpowder and by making a mine under the upper house of Parliament. And this is the topography, really, of Westminster, and this is the place that he's thinking about, or that they were thinking about. The Parliament House is over here on the far left, Westminster Hall, which is the only part of the old, ancient Westminster Palace to survive, and of course the Abbey over on the far right. And over the months, the plotters accumulated £1,800, about 36 barrels, of decayed corn gunpowder. It wasn't gunpowder of very great quality, but it was big enough and good enough to make a very big bang indeed. And that was Catesby's intention. This was an effort in a symbolic, an emphatic, devastating, shocking way. I mean, I suppose our closest equivalent would be an attack on the scale of 9/11. You know, that sort of physical, visceral attack on the fabric of power. Why Parliament? Well, again, the words of Fawkes, because Fawkes was one of the survivors. But the words are really sort of Catesby's as well. They belong to all of the conspirators. But it's very much kind of Catesby's notion here. Which place we made choice of the rather, because religion, that is the Catholic religion, the Catholic faith, of course, having been unjustly suppressed there, it was fittest that justice and punishment should be executed there. So the symbolic blow on Parliament, and a very definite and determined effort to kill the king, King James, to kill his heir and successor, Prince Henry Frederick, and any other member of the royal family who was close by, to kill the greater part of the English nobility and a fair number of the commons. And some of the plotters and some of the conspirators had conscientious doubts about killing the whole of nobility, the whole of the nobility. What if they should kill Catholic noblemen or Catholic-leaning noblemen? But Catesby was adamant. That had to be the plan. Whoever survived, survived. They would pray for the dead. The means was initially to drive a mine from a house that Percy, using his connections as one of the king's gentlemen pensioners, hired very close to the Parliament House. The mine was unsuccessful because they ran into the foundation walls of the House of Lords chamber. They couldn't get very much further. They made new recruits. This is a plot with 5 principals, but then with a number of individuals added. Christopher Wright, Robert Winter, and some others, latest being Francis Tresham. All of them doing slightly different things, sort of allied to the plot. Some of the individuals, like Tresham, were recruited to try and sort of raise a rebellion in the English Midlands, and also to kidnap the king's daughter, 9-year-old Princess Elizabeth, and to use her as puppet monarch. In fact, the conspirators had no clear sense of what they were going to do after the explosion. The principal thing was to bring the Parliament House down. So it was a smoking ruin. Beyond that, they had no real clear plan. They ran into the engineering problem, and this was really Fawkes's responsibility of driving the mine, as I say, into the foundation of the House of Lords. They couldn't get very much further, and they were running into problems in early 1604. But they realised that, fortuitously for them, a chamber directly under the House of Lords chamber had recently become free. So they took the lease and began to stock it with the barrels of gunpowder hidden away. And this was a job of months. They didn't know when Parliament was going to sit. Parliament was prorogued a number of times over the course of 1604. So they were waiting and waiting, stockpiling, waiting for their moment. We get to the point of discovery at the end of October 1605. And it all has to do with a document, with a letter, a very famous letter, a very strange letter, in a very odd, clotted hand with all kinds of weird and wonderful and slightly sort of elusive expressions. One stands out. They shall receive a terrible blow, this Parliament. And it was a letter from an anonymous source, disguised handwriting, delivered to a Catholic lord, Catholic baron, Lord Monteagle, by a servant, and handed to Monteagle by a servant who read it, and I think realised that it was significant enough to take to court and to take to the Earl of Salisbury. Monteagle probably had a fairly good idea. The author's disguised. It's probably the plotter, Francis Tresham, who's the least, I think, sort of convinced of the band. But Monteagle probably had inklings anyway. But he takes it to Robert Cecil that very night. But the king is away from London and Westminster, hunting in Hertfordshire. King James VI spent most of the time when he could on horseback hunting, either at Royston or in Newmarket. So eventually, probably on the 1st of November, the Earl of Salisbury has a private interview with the king, shows him the letter, and they try and work out what it's communicating. Robert Cecil says, at least, he doesn't think it means very much. The king isn't so sure. But they sit on the letter. They watch and they wait until famously the cellars of the Parliament chamber are searched on the 4th of November. And they find a man who calls himself John Johnson. That's the only name he gives, who is taken off and interrogated, and his interrogations begin in earnest on the 5th of November. I'm probably giving the game away, perhaps, but John Johnson is Guy Fawkes. So Johnson is the man. Johnson is the man in custody, and the manhunt begins on the 5th of November. An effort to gather in the conspirators, a number of whom, Catesby, Percy, Wright, and a couple of others, have made it into the Midlands in a desperate effort to try and raise local Catholic gentry in rebellion, and they fail. And there's a shootout at Holbeach Hall in Staffordshire, and a number of the key plotters, Catesby, the prominent one, are killed. Trials and executions of the conspirators in January 1606, and just very, very quickly, before I hand over, I'm going to mention, I've called it here Powder Treason Part 2. It isn't really, but it's an individual associated with the Gunpowder Plot for James's government in a very significant way. It's a Jesuit priest, the Jesuit superior in England, Father Henry Garnet, a man who'd been living secretly in England for the better part of 20 years. And at last, he's captured, where he calls himself Worley. But eventually, Salisbury and the King's Privy Council realise who they've got. Father Garnet, the man who seems to be hand in glove with the plotters and the conspirators, who had heard the confessions of the men involved in the plot, who must have known about the plot. And he is imprisoned in February, and tried and eventually executed. So in a sense, it's the kind of second phase of the plot investigation. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think that was a really brilliant introduction. It's really set the scene for everything that Catherine and Nadine are going to talk to you about today. So our next speaker will be Catherine Jenkinson. Catherine is a college lecturer and research fellow in history at Pembroke College, Oxford. She's also a researcher on the Oxford John Fell-funded project Histories of Violence, Myth-Making, Imprisonment, and the Cultural Identity of the Tower of London, which is a collaboration between Oxford, Historic Royal Palaces, and the Royal Armouries. Catherine is now going to draw on her doctoral research on the Tower's use as a prison in late Tudor and early Stuart England, as she explores the Gunpowder Plot's aftermath through the setting of the Tower of London. Over to you, Catherine.
Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. That's right. The uncovering of the Gunpowder Plot remains one of the most seismic moments of English history. Parliament was at the centre of the plot, but just down the Thames, at the eastern edge of the City of London's formal boundaries, the Tower of London was the headquarters of the Crown's investigation. Key commissioners, Robert Cecil chief among them, assembled to discover the details of the plot, at first in desperate haste to determine whether there was continued immediate or future threat, and later to learn how deeply the network of conspirators extended across England, and in fact, the broader European landscape. Tonight, I'd like to explore the role of the Tower in the official response to the Gunpowder Plot, with a particular eye to what the Hatfield House Archival collection can reveal about the Tower and the aftermath of the plot. Gunpowder Plot conspirators were held in a number of jails and prisons, but the plot's central suspects were incarcerated in the Tower. The Tower was an obvious choice. For nearly 1,000 years, it was used as a prison with varying frequency, all the way until the release of its final prisoners in the 1950s. The Tower is remembered as a prison, but actually it was so much more than that. A sort of centralized headquarters where state business took place. It was a royal palace, but it was also the state record office, home of the kingdom's treasures, armory and ordnance office, menagerie, and mint. The Tower, as the chief royal fortress and prison in England, had a particular history of incarcerating rebels or perceived rebels. The scale of the Gunpowder Plot may have been unprecedented, but threats to the crown were not. Cecil and his colleagues had previously led the official responses to various plots, from the Earl of Essex's failed coup against Elizabeth I to the main and by-plots at James I's accession in 1603, still fresh in everyone's memory, with Walter Raleigh languishing in the Tower. Cecil's father, Lord Burleigh II, was no stranger to official investigations. Burleigh had played a key role in responding to the unrelentingly frequent plots against Elizabeth I, including those which featured the Queen's cousin, Mary Queen of Scots. In all these instances, the Tower of London was the center of the Crown's efforts to suppress and punish rebellion and treasonous plots. And how wonderful to be looking at a screen and able to look at the wall next to us and see these portraits. In the early days of the discovery of the Gunpowder Plot, the investigations commissioners were racing against time to acquire information that could help them stop the conspiracy and apprehend everyone involved. Centrally located enough to allow the investigations commissioners to visit regularly, the tower allowed efficiency as a one-stop shop for the principal investigators to meet with suspects. The tower had always had a small prison population, at least in comparison to other prisons, and though its prisoners were from more diverse social backgrounds than has sometimes been acknowledged, many prisoners were members of the nobility or high-level state and church officials. Both Elizabeth I and William Cecil Lord Burleigh had spent short periods as prisoners there, as did a significant portion of the political and social elite. Members of the nobility were often held in other prisons besides the Tower, but in the aftermath of the Gunpowder Plot, Robert Cecil declared in a letter to the Ambassador Thomas Edmunds that, quote, "There is no other prison for the nobility, especially in any question for matter of state, but the Tower of London." That Cecil thought that the Tower was the right place for noble prisoners is clear, but often officials were less concerned with status than with the enormity of crimes people were accused of. Sir William Wade, who became lieutenant of the Tower just before the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, told Cecil in 1603 that the Tower held prisoners of quality, both by offense and calling. Indeed, perceived danger to the Crown was as important as status in determining who was sent there. There were other reasons to use the Tower. It was big enough to keep prisoners apart, at least in theory. In June 1605, just a few months before the Gunpowder Plot, Wade wrote to Cecil about a separate case, noting that, "In any other prison, your lordship doth know how hard a thing it is to have any prisoner kept from intelligence." Theoretically, the most secure prison in the realm because of the strength of its walls and close guard in association with its various state offices, the Tower was often selected seemingly in the hopes of keeping prisoners from escaping and, in some cases, away from contact with anyone but their prison guards, the yeoman warders who still occupy and look after the Tower today. In truth, the Tower was much less secure than officials hoped. There were occasionally escapes, secret messages and forbidden visitors came in and out, and even under close confinement, prisoners often found ways to subvert the authority of their keepers and the powers that had sent them to the Tower in the first place. If class was not always a determinant in who was sent to the Tower, it certainly was in how prisoners lived once there. Some prisoners lived in relative luxury, others in poverty, and a limited number of prisoners were subjected to torture. While Guy Fawkes and others were held as close prisoners without access to visitors or the comforts of home, some prisoners had a starkly different experience. When the 9th Earl of Northumberland was sent to the Tower in late November 1605, the first wave of the investigations had ended. While Fawkes and others were accused of planning and setting the plot in motion, Northumberland was accused of misprision of treason, as in knowing that an attack was going to be taking place but doing nothing about it. As a member of the Privy Council himself, in another context, he might have joined Cecil as one of the principal investigators. The Earl's incarceration in the Tower must have been something close to a rite of passage, albeit a bleak one. He joined a long lineage of Percy family members, including his own father, the 8th Earl, and members of his wife's family who had been incarcerated in the Tower under accusations of treason or related crimes. Only a few years earlier, his brother-in-law, the ill-fated Earl of Essex, had been executed within the Tower's walls. Here, Tower prisoners appear in bright green. This is very much an incomplete family tree, but I hope it gives you a sense of how common Tower incarceration was within the Percy family and beyond. The Earl wrote frequently to Cecil to ask for clemency and increased privileges, and many of those letters, like this one, survive in the archive here. He continually requested more and more, and the Earl lived in relative luxury in the Tower for more than 15 years. Here, he's asking for the incarceration to be as tolerable as it might be, and for access to his family and servants. At times, he was said to be able to employ approximately 20 Tower servants, including a cook, though this number ebbed and flowed depending on Privy Council demands. His accounts show that he ordered books, furniture, compasses, and a range of food and drink. Northumberland also received permission for his son Algernon, but not his wife or daughters, to come live with him in the prison. He'd only asked for his son to come. Algernon lived in the Tower, at least on a part-time basis, for a few years beginning in 1608. During that time, different tutors came to the Tower to teach the boy various subjects, including music, dance, and fencing. Space was always at a premium in the Tower, but for Northumberland's large household, he needed more room than most. The Earl lived in the Martin Tower and rented out the brick tower for his son and servants to use. Other prisoners later complained that the Earl had taken up all the king's fairest lodgings. When he had first arrived, the lieutenant had to rearrange prisoners' rooms to make space. On 26 November 1605, Wade, in conversation with Cecil, claimed that the only suitable rooms that could be used for the Earl were already occupied. He suggested various locations, including the Constable and Brick Towers in the northeast part of the fortress, but other prisoners were already there and weren't thrilled at the prospect of being forced to move to make way for this prisoner of higher rank. Rooms in the Brick Tower were imperfect in any case, since they had windows that overlooked the area directly outside the tower's walls. These were declared unfit, perhaps because a view of the area outside the tower provided too many opportunities for illicit communication. Guy Fawkes's first lodgings in an unspecified location were deemed to be inconvenient too, maybe because they weren't large or grand enough for a prisoner like the Earl of Northumberland. Here, the logistics of Tower housing were determined in consideration of security, status, and perhaps even accessibility for examiners to come and go in the course of their investigation. In addition to the demands of parenthood, the Earl occupied his time reading, managing his vast estates, and conducting alchemical experiments in a still house he had built within the Tower. Various entertainments were possible, and his bills show payment to a fool, a juggler, and to a man who showed the Earl the Tower's lions. He spent time with his friend and fellow prisoner Raleigh, played bowls, and gambled. Perhaps his frequent payments to Tower officials helped to ensure his continued freedom within the prison. Even as a prisoner associated with the most significant threat to James I's reign, a man like Northumberland maintained his social status and wealth. The Earl's experiences are not representative of most Tower prisoners, but they do reflect what was possible. The prison, like so many aspects of life in the 17th century, was socially stratified. Other prisoners implicated in the conspiracy who lacked the rank and wealth of Northumberland had very different experiences. While the Earl had furnished his carceral rooms with the comforts of home, others of small means needed the lieutenant of the Tower to provide basic items, including bedding. The Jesuit superior in England, Henry Garnet, who we just learned about, had been implicated in the plot but not captured until months later. When he was in the Tower, he wrote that he had a very fine chamber and was allowed every meal a good draught of excellent claret wine. But even so, he still needed friends outside the prison to help provide him with various items, including sheets, socks, and a Bible. This is an example of one of his letters. For many, Tower incarceration was uncomfortable, but for some it was even worse. Guy Fawkes, a man without title or rank, faced violence at the hands of the Jacobean authorities. King James himself issued a warrant for Fawkes's torture on 6 November 1605, along with a detailed list of matters for interrogation. The king ordered, quote, "If he will not otherwise confess, the gentler tortures are to be first used unto him, and sic per gradus ad ima tenditur. That is, the examiners should work their way up to the most severe forms of torture if the prisoner refused to cooperate. The order shows how desperate the Crown was to uncover this threat. If in retrospect it appears that the plot had been effectively prevented within the first few days of its initial discovery, in November 1605, officials had no idea how deeply the roots of the conspiracy extended and whether there remained imminent threat. Over the next few months, as they squeezed more and more information out of prisoners in scores of interrogations, investigators turned to their next task, preparing the legal cases for state trials. They needed not just information, but clear confessions too. Even if the outcome of the trials was largely a fait accompli, the authorities were working hard to manage public opinion and to combat allegations that they were persecuting Catholics for their religion rather than plotters for their treason. At the same time, they needed to respond decisively, in part to deter future plotters. To coerce confessions, in some cases, they threatened torture. For some prisoners, that was enough. For those that continued to resist, actual torture might then follow. In the same way that class and status were relevant in determining the prison to which a person was sent and the privileges one might receive once there, they also protected those of rank or relative prominence from being tortured, even when implicated in treason plots. There is no evidence that members of the nobility were tortured, either in the Tower or anywhere else in England in this period. William Shelley, held in the Tower in relation to involvement with the Throckmorton plot in the 1580s, recounted urging his fellow prisoner and fellow conspirator, Henry Percy, 8th Earl of Northumberland, the 9th Earl's father, to acknowledge that there was a difference between the two men. The Earl was a nobleman and in no danger of being tortured, so he could continue to resist the authorities' interrogations. Shelley, on the other hand, quote, being but a private gent, was therefore to be used with all extremities to be made confess the truth, end quote. Shelley was right, and he, unlike the Earl, was tortured in the Tower. Torture certainly occurred at the Tower, but despite the Tower's modern associations with violence, in fact, torture was very rare there. The use of torture was extremely limited in England, at least under the very narrow and limited legal definition contemporaries used. Not everything that we might think of as torture would qualify as torture then. In the 100 or so known cases of torture in this period, the Tower was often the venue. Unlike most other English prisons of the period, the Tower had the tools required for torture, including a rack to stretch the body, manacles, the body compression tool Scavenger's Daughter, and the famous Little Ease Chamber, a sort of crawl space so small that there wasn't room for a person to extend the body fully. Many historians have claimed that Fawkes was the only person to face torture in the aftermath of the unraveling of the plot, but this is a complex question. For one thing, because English authorities took the use of torture so seriously, and it was technically outside the scope of the law, it required approval from the monarch or the Privy Council acting on the monarch's behalf. The great bulk of records related to the use of torture in this period therefore appear in the Privy Council meeting registers, but the registers for years surrounding the Gunpowder Plot are lost. Determining the extent of the use of torture in response to this most significant threat to the Crown requires detective work. Here, the Hatfield House Archive and other private collections become all the more important. Together, they suggest that at least a few of the other suspects may also have been tortured. Correspondence between members of the Privy Council and the Tower Lieutenant in February 1606, after the first rounds of investigation, separately allowed the use of manacles or the rack against any prisoners of the inferior sort who refused to cooperate. A draft of a letter Cecil wrote in December 1605 is less specific, but leaves space to wonder whether torture was used more frequently in the Gunpowder Plot investigations than has sometimes been supposed. Cecil complained that the prisoners refused to name accomplices, quote, "what torture soever they be put to." This note is curious. It may suggest that torture was used. It may instead indicate that authorities knew torture was ineffective here, and therefore there was little reason for its use. Rumors abounded about the use of torture against Gunpowder Plot prisoners, including Henry Garnet and Nicholas Owen. In April 1606, Thomas Edmonds, the king's ambassador in Brussels, reported to Cecil that a rumor had traveled across the English Channel that Garnet had been forced into a false confession, quote, "after having suffered great torments on the rack and being kept many days without meat and sleep," end quote. Owen, on the other hand, who had allegedly taken his own life in the Tower, actually had been killed during torture, according to this rumor. The rumors were so strong, and the Crown was so eager to stop them, that there were Star Chamber charges against 2 recusants who'd been spreading the story that Owen had been tortured to death. Garnet himself claimed to have experienced torture, or at least the threat of torture, and said his servants had been tortured too. Rumors of torture spread in various forms to such a degree that it can be hard to separate rumor and fact in the absence of official records. Whatever else is true, it seems that torture was used sparingly in response to the Gunpowder Plot. Given the scale of the threat, perhaps it's a surprise that more torture wasn't used. One reason might be that officials had long been concerned about the usefulness of torture. The Elizabethan spy master Francis Walsingham in 1579, for instance, acknowledged that through torture, quote, "a man might be drawn to utter an untruth." Similarly, after the urgency of the gunpowder threat had receded, the extreme measure of torture may no longer have been seen as necessary. There was also concern about public outrage. Catholic polemic of the preceding 40 years had repeatedly condemned the Crown for its use of violence against Catholics, and rumors of torture became so common that Burleigh and his colleagues had felt forced to respond to and deny allegations of the widespread use of torture. In the aftermath of the Gunpowder Plot, yet again the authorities felt compelled to defend themselves, this time in response to conspiracy theories about the plot, a matter which we'll hear more about shortly. The polity's stability was fragile, and though they couldn't afford not to act quickly, they also couldn't afford the potential propaganda disaster that greater use of torture might provoke, not least because of the porousness of the Tower's walls. Secrets rarely stayed hidden there for long. To conclude, though Parliament was the site the plotters targeted, the Tower of London was where the bulk of the action in response to the plot's discovery unfolded. More than a rundown medieval fortress, as the site of incarceration for the principal conspirators and the headquarters of the investigation, the Tower was an enclosed, protected space where Cecil and his colleagues could probe the intricacies of a treason that was the greatest threat of its time. The use of the Tower amidst the plot's discovery reveals much about the Gunpowder Plot itself, but it also tells us something about Elizabethan and Jacobean statecraft and the ways that the Crown responded to and attempted to shield itself from danger. As with so many questions about 16th and 17th century England, the answers are to be found in the Cecil Papers here at Hatfield House. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was a really brilliant portrait of what life was like in the Tower for prisoners at the time of the plot. And I really encourage you to take a look at the exhibition again after this, because you will see a lot of the papers that Catherine was referring to, as well as a few library volumes that also testify to this experience. Our next speaker is going to be Nadine Ackerman. Nadine is Professor of Early Modern Literature and Culture at Leiden University. She's a textual historian, and she's also an award-winning author. She's both the biographer of Elizabeth Stuart, the princess whom the Gunpowder Plotters would have crowned their puppet queen had they been successful, and she's also the editor of Elizabeth's vast correspondence. Other works she's authored include Invisible Agents, Women in Espionage in 17th Century Britain, and her latest book, Spycraft, Tricks and Tools of the Dangerous Trade, co-written with Pete Langman, which The Economist rated as one of the top 5 non-fiction books of 2024, and you should all have leaflets about her lovely book. So I'm going to hand you over to Nadine to tell us all about the tools of the trade.
Thank you, Fannis, for that lovely introduction. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. After Catherine's fascinating talk about the Tower of London, I wanted to start by reassuring you that we're not going to leave the Tower quite yet. Because this evening I want to introduce you to a man who did some of his best secret work in the Tower of London, Arthur Gregory. And his flourishing signature perhaps portrays that Arthur wasn't really a humble man. This signature accompanied an intriguing letter he wrote to Robert Cecil, in which he commends his services done to Her Majesty and his ability to do her more. I love archives, in which you can find documents such as these, and I love to write about things others have not yet truly explored or seen. Men like Arthur Gregory, the man and sometimes women who labored at secret experiments, tested invisible ink recipes, designed codes, and made the myriads of other devices we can find in a spy's toolkit, and who are particularly hard to catch, as they stand in the shadows of the already shadowy world of the spies themselves. But they can be found lurking in the archives in Hatfield, in the Cecil Papers, and also in tonight's exhibition. Though the act of spying is associated with the rather ephemeral domain of secrets, by focusing on men like Arthur Gregory, we can get to the gritty, the grimy, the all too material reality of what they used in the field, or in our case tonight, in the Tower of London. In other words, my talk is perhaps not really about spies, but about that early modern equivalent of James Bond's gadget specialist, Q. Arthur Gregory was a Q. He was a counter-espionage agent, a genius, trying to make his name in the brutal and blood-soaked final decades of the 16th century and the first decade of the 17th century. He was a tech wizard with an ironic penchant for gunpowder, and he claimed expertise in anything mathematical, mechanical, martial. And he worked for various members of the English establishment, seeking, but for a long time failing, to find permanent employment in one of the discrete and competing spy networks of the day. By 1605, Arthur Gregory had retreated to his hometown of Lyme Regis, where he hoped to live out the remainder of his days as a custom officer. The gunpowder put a stop to this plan. While the main conspirators were caught pretty early on in proceedings, Robert Cecil was keen to lay his hands on England's senior Jesuit, Father Henry Garnet. Not only did he believe Garnet complicit in the plot, and thus a traitor, but he also believed that he could find any remaining conspirators through Father Henry Garnet. When Garnet was finally captured in 1606, Cecil brought Arthur Gregory out of retirement and gave him his own office in the Tower. But who was Gregory, and why did Cecil need Arthur? Arthur Gregory was not without his fame in his own lifetime, finding himself lauded in William Camden's famous history of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, The Annals of 1616. In this book, published a decade after Gregory's last fusee, Camden praised Gregory's ability to open and refold a letter packet so neatly that it was not to be perceived that they had been unsealed. Now, modern historians have not, in general, realized the sheer dexterity involved in opening and resealing letters, not to mention counterfeiting seals, and invariably talk of these activities without stopping to think of what that actually means. Many of the items in Gregory's spy toolkit were used for the most important skill of any counter-espionage agent: manipulating letters. After all, the primary job of a spy was, as it still is, to access information which they, or most likely their patrons, might use against their enemies. In this period, the only viable way to communicate over distance, other than by word of mouth, was through the humble letter. But like messengers, letters could be intercepted and interrogated. Unlike messengers, if you were good at your job, a letter could be interrogated imperceptibly. In times of conflict, whether or not the contents of a letter could be stolen could be the difference between life or death. The battlefield that the spy and counter-spy fought on was on the writing desk. Cecil's plan was to allow the imprisoned Jesuit Henry Garnet to correspond with his Catholic sympathizers, notably recusant gentlewoman Anne Fawkes. He was to monitor the letters in the hope that Garnet would expose any actors still at large. By intercepting their letters, he hoped to mop up the last remnants of the conspiracy. Now, intercepting the letters was the easy part. As well as installing eavesdroppers to listen in on the conversations between Garnet and Father Edward Aldcorn, the Jesuit with whom he had hidden in a squalid priest hall in Hindley Hall for several days and nights, and who was accidentally incarcerated in a cell immediately next to Garnet's, William Wade, Lieutenant of the Tower, also engineered a postal channel from Garnet to his nephew Thomas Garnet at the Gatehouse, and then to Anne Fawkes. And this was all being done because Garnet's jailer was going to pretend to be a Catholic sympathizer. Mary Queen of Scots had fallen for such tactics in the 1580s, and 20 years later they would work once more. But this was just the first step. Once you have a letter in your hand, the true work still had to begin. And Cecil knew that no one could manipulate letters like our Arthur Gregory. Before Gregory could get to grips with the message a letter contained, he had to open it, preferably without damaging it. After all, he also wanted to send the letter on, after he had read it, to keep the conversation going. Secretly opening letters may seem relatively straightforward if you think about steaming open envelopes. But the gummed envelope is a 19th century invention. 16th and 17th century letters were as intricate as origami birds. And they were formed by folding the paper on which the letter itself was written into its own letter packet. They often had security devices built into them, paper locks, pieces of paper threaded through the letter packet that would rip upon opening, thus betraying that the letter had been compromised. In 2021, a research group I was part of designed an algorithm which can unfold a closed letter digitally, thus not breaking its seal. Obviously, such techniques weren't around in the early modern period, and to defeat these anti-tamper devices meant either mending the damage caused by opening a letter with some fish glue, or, when this was impossible, counterfeiting all or part of it. And this was the only way to keep the conversation going. Now, the first security measure that presented itself was often the seal. A blob of molten wax into which a design had been pressed by a signet ring, simultaneously identifying the sender and by virtue of squeezing the wax into the fibers, and other open spaces of the letter's substrate, securing the letter from being easily opened. Now, these seals could be removed invisibly if treated with care. One could warm the wax before using a hair plucked from a horse's tail to detach the seal hole from the paper by slicing under it. But note that this was a very delicate operation. 17th century sealing wax was hard and brittle and prone to shattering, very much unlike our modern sealing wax. You could also be confronted with a paper seal, which saw the molten wax dripped between two pieces of paper, and then slicing under it was next to impossible. Luckily, men like Arthur Gregory had a how-to manual. Della Porta's Natural Magic, a so-called Book of Secrets, which was published in 1558. It recommended horsehair only for the most dexterous of hands. Others should just counterfeit a seal. They should make a plaster cast with gypsum or isinglass to directly mold a new seal. But casting with gypsum took time, and sometimes several days, and a counterfeiter might only have hours. Nothing was so likely to put the wind of a group of conspirators as a letter taking 4 days to reach its recipients, when it ought to have been there in 1 day. Such a delay was a surefire indicator of possible interception. It was the promise of speeding up the process of counterfeiting seals that had originally given Gregory employment with the Cecils. When Walsingham died in 1519, Arthur's first patron, employer, and second father, that meant that Arthur was bereft of an employer, bereft of a patron. He attempted to gain the favour with Robert Cecil, and he did so by offering 2 of his recent inventions, a calculator as well as a racing coach. And not much later, Gregory was busy counterfeiting seals for his new patron, spending countless hours in his home laboratory at Whitehall, trying to perfect his technique on which he had already worked for over a decade under Walsingham. Fully aware that to be useful, a counterfeit seal had to be both accurate but also produced quickly, Gregory looked beyond gypsum to formulate a casting compound that dried at speed and at a metallic hardness. It seems most likely that the formula he worked to perfect was inspired by Della Porta. Some of the Italians' recipes used toxic ingredients such as ceruse, white lead, verdigris, copper carbonate, and quicksilver, mercury. Neither Walsingham nor Cecil was ever allowed to touch these sealing metals, as it caused Gregory's eyes to swell dangerously and his hands to tremble for days. This counter-espionage agent was clearly poisoning himself for the sake of his art. This truly was a dangerous trade. But Gregory claimed success, and Cecil thus assumed that any seals Garnet and Elfo might use would not prove a problem for this cunning artificer, our trembling Arthur Gregory. This was still no guarantee of a successful surveillance operation, however. Once a counterfeit seal had been prepared and a letter opened, the counter-spy might find himself suddenly confronted by another security system, cipher and codes. This is a recreation of the enciphered letter that is assumed by practically everyone to have sentenced Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth I's rival to the throne of England, to death. Gregory had helped the Queen's codebreaker, Thomas Philippus, with copying all of Mary's cipher correspondence at the end of the Babington Plot. At the time, he had been annoyed that Burghley and Walsingham had gone to another man, Peter Bales, a London scrivener who had mastered the art of micrographia, or small writing, to forge his ciphered postscript to entrap Mary. But small writing was an exceptional skill, And I really thought it did not really exist. It was Peter Bales who simply bragged about being able to do this, until I found several letters in the Dutch archives. Micrographia was a spy technique that they used, which you can only read the letters with a magnifying glass. And by refolding the letters, we can see that they are so small as the tip of your little pinky. The problem with Garnet's letters was neither ciphers nor micrographia, however. It was that his messages were invisible. Garnet and Anfo wrote to another in invisible ink. Invisible ink was not always simple lemon juice. Cecil really needed someone who understood invisible inks. Gregory was his man. We know this because Gregory had written to Walsingham about his experiments with invisible inks of various kinds, including alum, which, as he demonstrated, could also be refilled with coal dust. Alum, which is a kind of mineral salt, was used for the textile trade and as a mordant for dyes and could be found in most pantries. As an invisible ink, it can be refilled with water or fire. When refilled with fire, the message is scorched into permanence. With water, the message fades as the paper dries, and it can be refilled again. Alum is the only invisible ink which, when it dries, becomes invisible again. And most pertinent in this instance is the fact that alum works exceptionally well on linen. Remember Garnet ordering all those pillar paces? Cecil suspected Garnet of using it on handkerchiefs and scarves. He also used orange juice. And if Gregory had thought this was alum and he would have dipped the letter in water, the orange juice would have washed away. So you really need to know what kind of invisible ink you're dealing with. Yet perhaps the most useful quality of invisible ink, if you discount the obvious point that you can't see it, is the difficulty it poses for any counter-spy intercepting such a letter or handkerchief. If you reveal the hidden writing, it has this annoying habit of remaining visible. The letter cannot then be resealed and sent on to its original recipient, even if you have counterfeited the seal perfectly and that the letter locking techniques pose no problem to you. And we see that here with one of Garnet's letters addressed to Anne. Cecil had the letter intercepted. The lieutenant revealed the invisible ink by heat, by holding it to a candle. But then they could not simply send it on. To keep a correspondence alive, so that the letter writers can further incriminate themselves, would necessitate your diligent counter-spy to counterfeit it. Now think about that for a moment. It's hard enough to copy another man's hand in the first place. You will need the correct quills for starters. Let's see. As different feathers suited different tasks. Goose feathers were best for everyday writing, swan feathers suited large lettering, and crow feathers fine lines. And these were also cut for a left hand or a right hand, whether you had a running hand or a slow hand. Now imagine having to do this without being able to see what you are doing. That truly takes things to another level. Luckily for us, and unluckily, as it turned out for Father Henry Garnet, Arthur Gregory seems to have devised a method of doing just that. Years later, he bragged to Robert Cecil. When he was lobbying for suitable financial reward, he wrote to him, "Your lordship hath had a present trial of that which none but myself had done before, to write in another man's hand, and discovering the secret writing being in blank. He could thus discover invisible ink." And he went on, "I could abuse a most cunning villain in his own subtlety, and leaving the same at last in blank again, I could forge an invisible ink letter. wherein though there be difficulty, their answers show they have no suspicion. Garnet and Anne didn't suspect a thing. Gregory had taken letters written with invisible ink, revealed their secrets, and rendered them invisible once again. That is, he had counterfeited the entire letter, invisible ink and all. Now think about it again. This means that this letter, exchanged between Garnet and Foe, that can be seen in the exhibition tonight, were never actually read by the intended recipients. What they read were Arthur Gregory's forgeries. The original was kept on file by Cecil, but never seen by Anne. Gregory accomplished this feat with an invention he called the perspective box. He first mentions this device in 1586, claiming that with it he could make rapid copies of ciphered letters and documents. Its first use being while assisting Philippus catching Mary. But he kept the precise design so close to his chest that it was almost lost to us. Unless, of course, it's still hiding in the attic next to a calculator and a racing coach. Luckily, by reading several of his letters alongside Della Porta's manual, we can deduce that it must have been an early version of the device not patented until 1807, the camera lucida. The camera lucida is an optical illusion generator, a kind of optical tracing paper, if you like. You look through a lens at your piece of paper, and the lens makes it appear as if the object, in this case a letter, is projected onto the paper. Then you can simply trace the image, perfect for forging another man's hand. His invention had to be reinvented 200 years later, because Gregory had kept his secrets for himself. Espionage was not merely a way of discovering secrets. In the end, of course, Garnet and Anne had nothing of interest to add to the story of the Gunpowder Plot. But Garnet was executed in a suitably grisly fashion. Anne was temporarily incarcerated, but she was set free. But it was also a stimulus for a man like Arthur Gregory. Though now we only remember him for folding some letters and perhaps counterfeiting a seal, perhaps you're glad to hear that he was suitably rewarded. He received a pension of £500 per year. That's £67,000 in today's money. If you want to know more about counterfeiting seals with mercury, letter locking, perspective boxes, or even poisons, you can read Spycraft, a book which I co-wrote with Pete Langman, my partner. And be quick to run to your local bookshop, because there's a rumor that only the first print run glows in the dark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadine. I can say I definitely recommend her book. It is fantastic and contains a huge amount of detail on all the amazing spycraft techniques that were in existence at the time. And as Nadine said, there's a few you can have a look at in the exhibition as well. You'll see ciphers, you'll see letter locking, you'll see invisible ink. We've got a lot of really fabulous examples here. So do take a look with your sort of new knowledge that you've just gained on spycraft in the Jacobean era. So our final speaker this evening is Stephen once again, who's going to sum this all up for us and who will dig into the plot's official investigation and allegations of a 17th century deep state conspiracy. Over to you.
I am the official bookender of the session. So, the Gunpowder Plot, a true and perfect relation. Do we have the complete story? Do we know the complete story? Well, no, we don't. There's lots we don't know. A huge amount of effort was put into uncovering the plot. We've had just a wonderful sense from Catherine and Nadine of the amount of time, the amount of ingenuity, the amount of effort that went into putting together the case against the plotters. But there is lots we don't know. In good part, because Catesby, who's really the key man, Catesby is the individual whose effigy, if we still put effigies on the top of bonfires, Catesby's is the effigy who should be really on top of on the bonfire. And he dies. He dies in the great shootout in Staffordshire. And other plotters and conspirators die also. We have confessions by Fawkes and Winter and others. Dozens and dozens of them. Hundreds of pages of official investigations, but we probably will never have the complete story. Some things were held back. The chief investigator, one of a number of royal commissions, privy councillors and senior lawyers, was Robert, Earl of Salisbury. He's all around us on the screen and on the walls. And it was Salisbury who, with his long-suffering principal secretary, Levinus Monk, gathered together much of the material and formed and framed the official narrative of the plot. In a sense, bringing together, weaving together, synthesizing all of that information. We get a sense, it's a team effort. On Garnet's letter, we saw on the screen, and you can go back out and have a look at the original. You saw those little annotations, or at least the notations for notes by the very busy and very formidable Attorney General Sir Edward Coke. So there's a whole team working on this, with Salisbury as a principal, and also another key member. Very handy that they're on the same portrait, Somerset House Conference in 1604, Henry Howard, Earl of Northampton, who's sitting on the screen just here next to Salisbury. But the official narrative, in many ways, is Salisbury. It's printed as the so-called King's Book, which again you'll see out in the display. Now, this plot, in a sense, was so big, so huge, to use a very scholarly term, so discombobulating in its scale and complexity, that even those investigators of it recognised that it was very easy to blur what may have been facts and what may have been fiction. Attorney General Coke, at the trial of the conspirators, described it as a plot in which was intended the destruction of frame and fabric, name and nation. This was to bring down the entire establishment. And that caused him to wonder out loud, rhetorically, whether it were fact or fiction. But very obviously for Coke, as lead prosecutor, it was fact, it was visceral fact, the worst kind of treason. But at the time, there were rumours. And we know that rumours were circulating late in 1605 and in 1606. In London, in Westminster, as we've heard a little bit earlier, in the Low Countries also, court at Brussels. Were the papers, were the confessions fabricated, forged? Were the plotters really the Earl of Salisbury's men, planted there, who would be reprieved at the final minute? And they very obviously weren't. Was there even gunpowder? That was a rumour at the end of 1605. It was all made up, pure conspiracy. So in a sense, we have this really interesting question, this enormous kind of treason, mind-boggling in its implications, that takes us from the statement of what the Gunpowder Plot was to a question. What was the Gunpowder Plot? And this notion that it may have been a conspiracy and that Robert Earl of Salisbury may have been behind that conspiracy were current in 1605, in 1606, in the years that follow, all the way through from the 16th century into the 19th century. It's an interesting book written by a Victorian Jesuit, John Gerard, who happened to share a name with a very eminent Elizabethan and Jacobean Jesuit, exactly the same name. What was the Gunpowder Plot, the traditional story tested by original evidence? And I'm just giving you a little sliver there of his contents page on the nefarious Earl of Salisbury, that sort of power-mad, corrupt politician who's obviously behind the big story. Now, this built on old ideas, libels, criticisms of the Cecil family more generally, not just Robert, but his father, Lord Burleigh, also. In angry English Catholic dissident polemic, Cecil was the fox. He's the ultimate power politician. And whether it's the poet Edmund Spenser, whether it's the English Catholic emigre Richard Verstegen, whether it's even the poet and dramatist Ben Jonson, all of them, have a little bit of a track record in very, very subtle ways in their works and their poetry and their literature on stage. Jonson does it with Volpone in 1606, that key year, in the character of Sir Politic would-be. They all poke and prod at Cecil Salisbury, the power politician. So Sir Politic would-be in Volpone speaks of one politician of his acquaintance. I knew him one of the most dangerous heads living within the state. And it's a poke and a prod at Salisbury. A little footnote. Jonson is clearly one of those characters in history who likes to have their cake and eat it, because he may have been poking and prodding at Robert, Earl of Salisbury, but also he's a very obedient client of the Earl of Salisbury at the same time, and wrote enormously kind of effusive poems and sonnets and presentations, and scripted many of the great kind of entertainments that Salisbury hosted in the Jacobean years. So Jonson gets it both ways. Now, in a very obvious, tangible, visceral sort of way, Robert Cecil knew exactly what people thought of him. And some went so far as to send a death threat in the wake of the Gunpowder Plot, and we know that it was dropped anonymously into the court of Salisbury House in Westminster on the 4th of December 1605. And you can get a little further acquainted with it out in the exhibition. And here Salisbury is described as the prime mover of the plot. The said most inhuman and barbarous project. There's nothing that Salisbury couldn't engineer. This was going to be the ultimate plot to destroy English Catholics and English Catholicism once and for all. And in this conspiracy, in this threatening letter, a number of English Catholic gentlemen had kept themselves anonymous, of course, had said that they banded together to take Salisbury's life as payment. He was a reticent sort of character in many ways, a politician to his fingertips, behind the scenes, a mover of the levers of power instinctively. He wasn't built as a public performer. In many ways, he was always reticent. He was always reluctant to go public. But this death threat in December 1605 pushed even Robert Earl of Salisbury to go public. And he wrote a pamphlet, short book, called An Answer to Certain Scandalous Papers. And again, you've probably seen it already. You can see it again in a few minutes' time, in which, reluctantly, he describes himself as like a woman experiencing the labours of childbirth. So hard is it for him to explain himself, to have to explain himself in this way against such an appalling charge that he should have manufactured this plot. But he talks about his duty and service, to stand sentinel over the life of kings and the safety of states. And he throws the allegation right back at the English Catholic traitors. And powerful words. These men, the Catholics, Catholic priests like Father Garnet and others, Old Court, Testament, these men that rule your consciences have first dazzled your eyes with fearful but false objects, thereby hoping to engage you more deeply in their pernicious attempts. They have sought with Nero to set Rome on fire and to lay the blame on Christians. And he pretty much concludes that pamphlet by saying, and that's all you're going to get from me. I'm going to be silent from now on, but will keep an eye on the king's enemies. So that is, well, the end of my bookended conclusion, the end of the plot, although I'm sure not the end of discussion about the plot. I hope that what we've experienced here, what we've felt, is the complexity, is the scale, the layering, just the amount of work and effort, and the surprise of this plot, because I really think it was a surprise. Scale of this threat and assault to bring down the entire establishment. And we see so much of it traced out in the papers at Hatfield. Thank you very much.